سخنران بعدی ما آقای سر جفری نایس، پروفسور حقوق، وکیل بین المللی و عضو هیئت حقوقی دادگاه مردمی ایران تریبونال. موضوع سخنرانی گزارشگر ویژه و محدودیت‌های عملی او. بفرمایید.
I have not been to Iran, and I don't pretend to have particular knowledge of its history or its geography. And yet, my slight participation as it was in the informal Iran tribunal proved to be one of the most important things I have done in my career, either recently or perhaps at all. And the significance I felt by participating in the tribunal was, I think, also felt by those who merely observed it. Why should that have been so? Was it, as it could have been, that the testimony of several people, but particularly of Shekufe, showed us so much about humanity when she showed us how you could survive the terrible things she survived and form relationships with other people within that could sustain you by whatever difficult means? Was it that? Maybe. But I think not. I think this tribunal had and has, to some degree in the ways covered by Shekufe already and Hamid, much greater significance. Let me approach it in a roundabout way before I make the point. I was engaged along with one other lawyer by the already formed group of people who constituted the tribunal to give a bit of legal advice which they thought they needed. So we gave it. They received it. And generally they rejected it. And they were by and large right to reject it. And that's a bit of a pointer to the value of this tribunal. Their rejecting our advice was one of the seeds that was to grow into the great significance that this tribunal had. Let's remember how recent is the idea that war should be subject either to law or to any kind of post-conflict examination by a court. The same considerations applying to examination of internal conflicts of the kind described by Hamid and Shekufe. Until the end of the 19th century, there was barely any law. And it was not until after the First World War that consideration was given to putting people who might have committed what might be called war crimes before tribunals. But let's look at the development, not from the point of view of the victims, at least for the time being, upon whom Mr. de Grief wishes us to concentrate, but from the point of view of who was trying or going to try these possible criminals. Well, after the First World War, if anything had happened, and very little did, it would have been the victorious state powers. That's what happened, to some criticism, after the Second World War. It was the victor states who tried the people. there was a particular trial, Eichmann, who was tried by the victim state. There were one or two trials. A man called Demaniuk may come to the mind of some, who were tried by independent states who happened to have universal jurisdiction over certain crimes and happened to find possible criminals in their jurisdictions. And then there were the ICTY and the ICTR ad hoc tribunals established by the United Nations, who had already established the International Criminal Court of Justice, which can on occasions deal with this sort of thing. Then there were hybrid tribunals at East Timor and elsewhere, and Cambodia, and then the Permanent Court. All courts established by international bodies. None of these courts, you know, is evidence as having done a great deal by way of reconciliation. A reconciliation may not be their function. All have been the subject of criticism that they are subject to political influence or manipulation. Rarely, not never, but rarely, do victims praise the works of these courts wholeheartedly. All of the courts do a great service by the record of history that they enlarge and leave, and some do something for retribution, but it's usually of a limited number of people selected for trial who will serve sentences and pass into an oblivion, adding perhaps little to the broader sense of justice that it may be we seek. The independent observer, seeing the hodgepodge, the random nature of the work of these courts, might think that states aren't actually, and international bodies aren't actually that concerned with victims when there are other interests of a political nature that they can serve. And victims of many, probably almost innumerable atrocities that are known to us but are not dealt with by international bodies may well be expected to end their lives, their own lives, whether they are personal victims or victims by being related to by being the bereaved of people who were killed as victims. They may be expected to end their lives with the proper narrative of their suffering never told. Is that a trivial matter that can be brushed aside by international bodies because it's inconvenient to set a record of a particular atrocity? Because that has happened. Think, if you will, of the comfort women of Japan, many of whom died with no expectation that their suffering would be brought to the public attention, because they died before 2000, in which an informal tribunal of great eminence laid out that these terrible things had happened, caused by, inter alia, the emperor, who had been the object of such arguably cynical protection by the Americans when they established the Japanese tribunals. What about the victims of Vietnam, who have never had a formal decision and only the benefit of an informal tribunal as to whether their suffering was under crimes against humanity committed by an overpowerful country against a rather smaller one? What about the mothers of Srebrenica, who have still been denied a proper narrative of what happened in that most recent European massacre, because it doesn't suit the international community to allow full responsibility both in Serbia and in the international community that is culpable to a degree for what happened at Srebrenica for being told. These are all people, or the Rohingya of Burma, for example, the North Koreans whose case is being dealt with this afternoon in another room here, that has the benefit of a very powerful report, and yet recognises that that report may, if they're not careful, land up gathering dust. And, of course, included in such people who may be expected by the international community to end their lives without the proper narrative being told, are those from Iran in the 1980s. Those who survived, and the victim bereaved of those who didn't. It was to this problem that the diaspora citizenry of Iran around the world came together. I'm told Iranians are not that easy to herd. They are somewhat independent-minded. But they came together for the single purpose, maybe a first step, but a single purpose of setting a record, doing it publicly, and, courtesy of modern technology, feeding it straight back into Iran, where I think it was millions of hits on the broadcast were recorded. And I now come back to the beginning, focusing less perhaps on the Special Rapporteur than the title might suggest I should have done, but I don't care about that. Because what was important for all of us, outsiders like me, viewers of the tribunal's hearings, what was important for us was simply to see the citizen empowered, doing for themselves what they knew institutions, state, interstate, international, would not do for them. And what we were witnessing then, and that's why this is so important, because it's not just important for Iran. What we were witnessing then was the slow awakening in the citizen that the things at his fingertips and in his hand are giving him the power to fill the gap that state institutions and international institutions choose not to fill. And those bodies represented in this building, represented by the Special Rapporteur Pablo de Grief, have now to recognize, certainly for this stage of the process, the setting of a record, but also for later stages, that they will gather and they will have and retain no respect from the citizen if they do not do what they should by way of this first stage, by setting records for conflicts that need to be set. And of course it follows from that that they will gain and have no respect if they do not do the other things they can do, moving towards processes that can bring retribution, judgment, and those other forms of justice. If they don't do that, mindful of the fact that the citizen can do, and has done in this case, so much on their own.